Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Usually when we think about breathing, we picture this simple mechanical bellows, like your chest expands, air rushes in.
Right, and then your chest contracts and air rushes out. It feels very intuitive.
It really does. But, zoom in, and that simplistic model completely falls apart. You are actually looking at this high-speed, invisible transaction.
Oh, absolutely. A transaction happening millions of times a second across membranes that are thinner than a fraction of a hair.
It's wild. Welcome to our deep dive. Imagine you are seeing medical physiology for the very first time. Our mission today is to take the dense, intimidating material of Chapter 40 from the Guyton textbook of Medical Physiology, 15th edition, and translate it.
Right. We want to turn it into a plain-spoken, logical journey for you. It's the absolute definition of physiological elegance.
Exactly. Because this isn't just a list of random facts, it's a chain of cause and effect. We're going to guide you through the physics of gases, how your lungs' anatomy perfectly exploits those physics, and then what happens when the whole system breaks down.
We like to think of respiration as just moving air, but the true essence is a profound interception of pure physical chemistry and anatomy.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before understanding the lungs, we really have to understand the invisible rules governing the gases we're breathing. Think of a room full of ping pong balls bouncing randomly.
That is a great analogy for partial pressure. The pressure on the walls of that room is simply the summated force of those ping pong balls impacting it.
So let's start with the atmosphere at sea level. The air exerting pressure on us right now sits at a total of 760 millimeters of mercury. And it's basically just two gases.
Right, roughly 79% nitrogen and 21% oxygen.
Which means those gases share that total pressure proportionally. Nitrogen is about 600 millimeters of mercury, and oxygen exerts about 160.
And those individual numbers are your partial pressures. But the physics completely change the moment those free-floating atmospheric gases hit a liquid.
Because gas exchange in the human body is all about moving molecules from an air phase into a fluid phase, right? Like water and blood plasma.
Exactly. And this is governed by Henry's law,
which dictates that the partial pressure of a gas dissolved in a fluid equals its concentration divided by its solubility coefficient.
In simple terms, how hard the gas molecules are trying to escape the liquid depends on how much gas is in there, divided by how much the gas actually, likes being in the liquid.
And the variation between different gases is just staggering.
Yeah.
Like a carbon dioxide is over 20 times more soluble in body fluids than oxygen.
Right. It is highly attracted to the aqueous environment of our tissues.
Wait, hold on. If carbon dioxide is so violently attracted to water, wouldn't it just flood into the blood, pack tightly, and cause massive, dangerous pressure spikes?
It's a very counterintuitive reality, actually. The high solubility means it does the exact opposite.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because carbon dioxide molecules are chemically attracted to the fluid, they essentially nestle into the water. They don't bounce around frantically trying to escape.
So because they aren't violently bouncing, they don't generate high pressure.
Precisely. You can pack an enormous concentration of CO2 into blood plasma with barely any rise in pressure. Oxygen, on the other hand, is generally repelled by water.
So even a tiny amount of dissolved oxygen will violently bounce around, creating a very high partial pressure.
Yes, and that distinction explains so much about clinical physiology. It's the same physics that dictates why deep-sea divers have to worry about the bends.
Right. Because at extreme underwater pressures, gases are forced into solution in the blood, and when the diver surfaces and the pressure drops, those gases just frantically try to escape the fluid, forming bubbles.
Exactly. The physical constraints are universal. But our bodies have evolved this highly controlled environment to manage these gases before they even touch the bloodstream.
Which brings up a critical physiological hurdle. The respiratory tract isn't just a sterile, dry tube. It's incredibly wet and warm.
Right. The moment atmospheric air enters your nose and mouth, it undergoes a radical transformation. It is instantly and entirely humidified.
At our normal body temperature, around 37 degrees Celsius, water vapor molecules are constantly escaping the fluid lining and entering the gas phase.
And those water molecules exert their own kinetic force, which is water vapor pressure. At body temperature, that pressure is a rock-solid 47 millimeters of mercury.
And since the total pressure deep inside the lungs can't magically exceed the atmospheric 760, That water vapor literally steals real estate.
It physically dilutes the oxygen and nitrogen. Just by inhaling, the partial pressure of oxygen instantly drops from 159 down to 149 millimeters of mercury.
That dilution is the first major change. The second is how the lung manages the actual volume of fresh air coming in.
Right, a concept known as slow renewal.
And the textbook illustrates this beautifully in figures 40.2 and 40.3. If you measure the total volume of air sitting in an average person's lungs at the end of a normal exhale, it's about 2,300 milliliters.
That's your functional residual capacity.
But a single normal breath only pulls in about 350 milliliters of new air.
So you're replacing roughly 1/7 of the stagnant lung air with each breath.
If you plotted that on a graph, it wouldn't be a sharp spike. You'd see this long, sweeping, exponential decay curve.
Exactly. It takes an average of 16 continuous breaths, which is roughly 17 seconds of resting ventilation, just to replace half of the old alveolar air with new air.
Which seems crazy. Why on earth would an organ dedicated to oxygen delivery be designed to be so sluggish? You'd think you would want to flush the system instantly.
What's fascinating here is that you would want that, until you factor in the sheer volatility of human metabolism. This slow renewal is a brilliant evolutionary shock absorber.
It's a stability buffer for your blood gases.
Right. Imagine if a single deep breath instantly replaced all the air in your lungs. Your blood oxygen levels would wildly spike, carbon dioxide would plummet, and your blood pH would swing dangerously alkaline.
So by only cycling 1/7 of the air, the lung creates this remarkably stable internal atmosphere.
Physiologists call this the operating point. You can visualize this if you look at figures 40.4 and 40.5. Imagine a graph where alveolar ventilation is on the x-axis and gas pressure is on the y-axis.
Okay, I got the graph in my head.
For a healthy person at rest, breathing normally, the partial pressure of oxygen deep inside the alveoli settles firmly at 104 millimeters of mercury, and the carbon dioxide anchors at exactly 40.
And the body fights aggressively to maintain those numbers. Like, if you start jogging, your muscles might suddenly burn through 1,000 milliliters of oxygen a minute.
And to prevent the alveolar oxygen pressure from crashing below 104, your breathing rate and depth have to increase symmetrically. A 4-fold increase in demand requires a 4-fold increase in ventilation.
Just to keep that environment completely stable. So here's where it gets really interesting. We have this perfectly humidified, stable reservoir of gas. How does it get into the blood?
Anatomy supports function. Inside your two lungs, you have roughly 300 million microscopic air sacs, the alveoli.
And figure 40.8 shows that the capillary network around them isn't a web of distinct tubes. It's almost an unbroken sheet of flowing blood hugging the alveoli.
To conceptualize the scale of this, you have to look at the total surface area and the total blood volume.
The contrast is wild. If you flatten out the respiratory membrane from those 300 million alveoli, it covers about 70 square meters. That's the floor of a 25 by 30 foot room.
But at any given second, the actual volume of blood flowing through that massive network is tiny, only about 60 to 140 milliliters.
Which is literally the volume of a single glass of wine. Imagine spreading one wine glass full of blood so unbelievably thin that it covers an entire room's floor.
It's astonishing, and the barrier separating that air from the blood, the respiratory membrane, is incredibly complex.
Right. Looking at the ultrastructure in figure 40.9, it actually has 6 distinct layers.
Yes. First, a layer of fluid containing surfactant. Second, the alveolar epithelial cells.
What?
Third, an epithelial basement membrane.
Okay, so that's 3.
Then fourth, a microscopic interstitial space. Fifth, the capillary basement membrane. And finally, the capillary endothelial cells.
Wait, 6 layers to cross. That sounds like a massive barricade. Distance is the ultimate enemy of gas diffusion. How do molecules move fast enough to keep us alive?
Because the absolute thickness of all 6 layers combined is almost incomprehensibly small. It averages just 0.6 micrometers.
Less than 1/100th the thickness of human hair.
Furthermore, the pulmonary capillaries are so narrow, just 5 micrometers across, that the red blood cells must literally squeeze through them single file.
Meaning the red blood cell membrane is physically scraping against the capillary wall.
Exactly. The gases do not even have to swim through any significant amount of blood plasma. Oxygen jumps straight from the airspace across the membrane and lands instantly inside the red blood cell.
Because the anatomy is optimized down to the micrometer, the system pulls off incredible feats of speed. And physiologists measure this using diffusing capacity, right?
Yes, which is the volume of gas diffusing each minute for a pressure difference of 1 millimeter of mercury.
For oxygen at rest, it's 21 milliliters per minute per millimeter of mercury. And since our normal pressure gradient is about 11, it perfectly supplies the 230 milliliters of oxygen the body needs.
But during exercise, this capacity actually triples. Dormant capillaries open up, increasing the surface area exposed to the air.
Now, what about carbon dioxide? You mentioned earlier its solubility is 20 times higher.
Because of that immense solubility, its diffusing capacity is massive, around 400 milliliters per minute per millimeter of mercury.
Oh, wow.
It diffuses so rapidly that the pressure difference between the blood and alveolar air is often less than a single millimeter of mercury. It's practically impossible to measure directly.
Which raises a fascinating question. If measuring pulmonary capillary oxygen or CO2 is so difficult, how do doctors actually test if a patient's membrane is damaged in a lab?
They bypass it entirely by using the carbon monoxide trick.
Wait, carbon monoxide, the toxic gas that causes lethal asphyxiation. Why would they use a poison?
I know it sounds alarming, but it's elegant physics. The patient breathes a tiny, completely safe trace amount of carbon monoxide.
Okay.
Hemoglobin has an aggressive, almost extreme chemical affinity for it, about 250 times stronger than for oxygen.
So the moment it crosses the membrane, it is violently snatched up by the hemoglobin.
Precisely. It never floats free in the blood plasma, so the blood pressure of carbon monoxide stays at absolute zero.
Oh, that is brilliant. Since the blood pressure is zero, the pressure gradient driving the diffusion is just equal to the alveolar air sample.
Exactly. You measure the carbon monoxide uptake, calculate its diffusing capacity, and then simply multiply by 1.23.
Because that's the ratio of oxygen to carbon monoxide diffusion coefficient.
You've got it. It gives a perfect measurement of membrane integrity, but all of this assumes the plumbing is perfectly intact.
Right. It assumes every alveolus getting fresh air is surrounded by flowing blood. But what happens in the real world when airflow and blood flow don't match?
So what does this all mean? It brings us to the ventilation-perfusion ratio, or V over Q.
Ventilation is the air, perfusion is the blood.
To understand the implications, we use the PO2, PCO2 diagram, which is figure 40.11 in the text. Let's look at the first extreme, where V over Q equals 0.
That means there's perfusion blood is flowing, but zero ventilation. Like a blocked airway.
Right. Think of a delivery truck driving past a warehouse where the loading dock doors are jammed. The blood goes past, but no oxygen can load up.
So the alveolar air just comes into total equilibrium with the venous blood. The oxygen drops to 40, and the carbon dioxide rises to 45.
And this unoxygenated blood is called a physiological shunt.
Got it. Now, extreme 2 is a VQ ratio of infinity. Ventilation is perfect, but there's zero perfusion. The delivery truck never shows up.
Imagine a massive blood clot blocking a capillary bed. The patient is breathing pristine air, but there's no blood to pick up the oxygen.
So alveolar oxygen stays at 149, and carbon dioxide is zero. This wasted air is called physiological dead space.
And you don't even need a severe illness for this to happen. Just standing upright alters your VQ ratio.
Oh, right, gravity.
Yeah, gravity pulls blood downward. So the top of a healthy person's lung has high VQ, meaning moderate dead space, and the bottom has low VQ, creating a small physiological shunt.
But exercise corrects this by increasing cardiac output and flooding the upper lung with blood. But what about when disease strikes, like COPD or emphysema?
In COPD, both extremes happen at once. Chronic inflammation blocks bronchioles, which creates massive physiological shunts where V equals 0.
While the emphysema aspect literally destroys the delicate alveolar walls, taking the capillary beds with them.
Right, which creates massive physiological dead space where V equals infinity. You have severe shunting and dead space simultaneously, drastically reducing efficiency.
It really is a fragile architecture. Let's recap the logical chain. Basic gas laws govern the pressures. Anatomical design maximizes surface area, and integrated ventilation-perfusion matching ensures survival.
Every breath is just an engineering marvel. And I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder based on all this.
Let's hear it.
We just discussed how gravity creates dead space at the top of the lungs and shunts at the bottom in a standing person. Imagine what happens to the ventilation-perfusion ratio of astronauts in zero gravity.
Wait, really? With no gravity to pull blood down, the concepts of top and bottom vanish.
Exactly. The entire map of pulmonary blood flow is rewritten. Or think about deep-sea divers breathing pressurized gas mixtures where Henry's law is pushed to the extreme.
That is mind-blowing to think about. The physics stay the same, but the anatomical reality completely shifts. Well, on behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, I want to extend a huge thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
The next time you take a deep breath, just remember that invisible high-speed transaction keeping you alive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will catch you next time.